Should I ask where's the clicker?
Oh, you mean PowerPoint?
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, we
It's fine.
just use the actually
And you got it.
on this thing.
So we want the present third one right there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Technical issues. All right. Thank you for coming. I'm going to just start out with a quick background on the program that we've been getting grants from for several years, the NGGDPP. Boy, that's a mouthful. It's hardly any shorter than the full name. It's established by the Energy Policy Act of 2005 to archive geological, geophysical, and engineering data, maps, well logs, and samples, and also to provide a national catalog of the archived materials, and to provide technical and financial assistance to state geological surveys, and also a few relevant BOI bureaus. I'm just going to show a couple of slides from their implementation plan, and just showing this to give you an idea that, well, there's some big numbers out there, as you can see. And also, just looking at these pictures, you might think they're from our survey, but no, they're not. A lot of other surveys have similar issues. And actually, Don will be talking about some of those a little bit later. So anyway, the NGGDPP provides grants to preserve, digitize, document, and index collections. Most state surveys actually have participated at one time or another, and it's mostly limited to state surveys. And roughly 25 proposals are approved each year out of roughly 30 applications. But the total funding is only about $600K, so that doesn't really leave a lot of money to do any kind of a major project. But it does let us do a lot of thinking about our collections, and it has done that definitely. And we've still gotten quite a bit done, but certainly not going to be building a new core storage building or anything like that with these grants. So we started way back in 2008, actually kind of a funny story. I came back from vacation, if I remember correctly, only to discover that I was made PI on a preservation project by Don Kiefer and Zach Lasemi. And basically, I've been at it ever since. Zach's been acting as the co-PI, and he's been very helpful, both him and Don Kiefer, in picking out collections to work on. And also, I want to mention Don Mikulik, who actually works with a lot of these collections or has worked with them, and he's helped out in several of the projects, and he's been very instrumental in helping to pick out collections. He probably knows more about some of our lesser known collections than anyone, certainly anyone I know. And also various other people have helped when we process certain collections. Rod Murray in particular has worked on several of the paleo collections with me, and there's still a lot to go. I generally hire students to do things like scanning and data entry where appropriate, and occasionally use U of I temporary help. Basically, the primary deliverable to the USGS is item-level metadata describing the collection that you're working on. And in particular, they especially want coordinates so that you have a geospatial representation of the collection. As a matter of fact, that's really about the only required item in the metadata, other than obviously title and description and that type of thing. And this metadata then becomes part of the national catalog where, in theory, people can look it up. I'm not going to go over each one of these, but these are many of the collections that we've done over the past several years. You can see there's a wide variety of all sorts of different types. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have heard of. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about one collection that we have lot of data on, and that's the lead zinc district. Let's see, you're down here. Basically, we've done a few projects working away at all this data, and I'm going to go over a little bit about that. Of course, we got our own primary records at GRU, but besides that, there's some confidential logbooks. There's actually 8 confidential logbooks from Joe Davies County over in the back room of GRU. Industrial minerals, they have lots of material in storage, historic data, logs organized by mining company, field notes, mineral assays, the mine gossip, logs, lots of historical files, including some unpublished reports. Also, over the last few years, I kind of discovered, with the help of Don Mikulik, actually, the U.S. Bureau of Mines Illinois Mineral Development Atlas, and that's what's sitting up here at the front of the room here in 2 parts. These large maps, which are the scale of 1 inch equals 200 feet, and then also corresponding logs. And this is just one of 4 log books. It's probably the best organized set of data, historical data anyway, outside of our main systems like Oracle, et cetera, that we have. We also have a lot of original mining company records, which Don Mikulik, again, has been instrumental in obtaining, but we have a lot of it. We've only scratched the surface of it. We've got 16 filing boxes full of records, hundreds of maps. It's a lot of stuff that's potentially valuable. Just as an example, this is the type of stuff that's in the mine records generally from closed mining companies, a lot of original records. This is a mine log or a borehole log from 1909. This is a close-up of a mine map a little bit later, I think in the 50s or 60s, and it's just a small section, but you can see it's very detailed borehole locations are marked here. And this is just a piece of a map that's actually up on the table there, that when you roll it out, it's about over 9 feet long. And actually our scanner gives up just before the end of it. Interesting enough, I guess it doesn't believe that any map can be that big. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the IMDA, the Illinois Mineral Development Atlas. We actually discovered this in 2 pieces, in 2 widely disparate parts of the building. One part had the maps. Okay, what happened here? One part had this very large set of maps, again at that large scale, and the other part had the logs, and they weren't together. But what we did was we scanned and georeferenced the maps. We then also scanned the logs and then connected the logs to the maps. But probably the biggest part of the project was reconciling all this data with our existing data, because of course we already knew we had much of this data, but we really didn't know how much. We just decided to do it all because it was a nice consistent collection, and so we now have it all in one place. And through the reconciliation, we did discover approximately 1,000 additional boreholes that we did not have in our original data. Just really quickly, this is basically data we already had from past projects and or past historical data that we already had in GRU or in Oracle. These are boreholes in Joe Davies County. And I then plotted basically behind these the IMDA additional new logs that we added or will be adding. And you can see that there was, considerable activity in some areas, for example, here, in various places here, down here. But the other interesting thing that shows, if you look really closely, you can see that some of the locations are just a little bit different, even though they're, in theory, both very precise. For example, this one here is a little bit different. So that just brings up another issue, in which there are many working with historical data. We've actually got 2 locations for some of these now. And we also digitized, the maps also included mines and diggings, basically, so we also captured those and digitized them. Just very quickly, some of the issues. People that know me probably know I'm kind of a whiner, and I tend to whine about more than I should. But one thing that almost always comes up is there's always issues with PLSS locations. Like a lot of them won't generate a coordinate, and I wind up spending a lot of time figuring out, well, what's wrong? Why won't it generate a coordinate? And I'm not going to go into any detail about that. But anyway, that's one of the issues. Of course, just getting coordinates, which you really want spatial locations, and they're required anyway for the project. You know, sometimes you got to do research, and then when you reconcile with existing data, well, you see there's differences. You know, well, there's a difference. Well, where is the error? And it takes some time and some research to figure that out. But fortunately, we can correct issues in our data when there are some. So that part's positive. Student hourlies, well, I generally use student hourlies. The results can be variable, as some of you probably know. I sometimes wish I could hire academic hourlies, but unfortunately, the U of I considers this clerical work and civil service, and I can't do it. Just very quickly, Don's going to talk more about this TARP project, but I just wanted to show an example of the issues with sections. These are TARP borehole locations, and they're actually surveyed in state plane coordinates, so nobody cared what section they were in. But as you probably know, in Illinois, roads go down section lines, and when they were drilling these TARP boreholes, they went down roads and kind of went down, say, either side of a road, for example, here. So they were going down essentially a section line, or even in this case, it's actually a township line too. And they were, you know, going on either side of the road. Again, these are very, very precise. And the issue comes up, well, when we get data like core data or whatever, it needs to be filed somewhere. And I've actually discovered in this project duplicate copies of the same borehole. You know, some data came in, it was filed in one section, even one township, and then later some more data came in, it was filed in the other township. And I kind of understand how that can happen, because back in those days you had to plot it on a map and, you know, convert from state plane coordinates and that kind of thing and give it a section. But it's just one of, you know, that's one of the things that happens. Another thing that sometimes could potentially come up is, see this Indian boundary line here. Well, this section here has the same section number as this section here. Oops, can't quite get to that one there. So that's potentially an issue too for finding things. Anyway, enough whining. Let me go on to what are our results. Well, it varies by collection. Of course, we always do item level metadata and provide locations. We often scan paper records and tie them to the location and metadata in the geodatabase. Some of the larger collections, we only do metadata, and therefore you can look up something, but then you'd have to go to the paper records to actually obtain the data. Depending on the collection and the resources, we sometimes data enter additional data. For example, for our lead zinc boreholes, for this project here and some earlier ones, we entered formation tops and also mineral estimates and assays going down the boreholes. So we actually have quite a bit of three-dimensional data about this area, at least where the boreholes are. And then sometimes we only do subsets of collections. For example, there's a lot of paleo collections yet to be done. Where are the results? I'm sure someone's going to ask, so I will try to answer that now. And good question, it depends. Some fit into our existing Oracle-based systems. Some are in GeoBases or links on our staff website. Some are in Oracle, on Sinkhole in the geodatabase, or still in process, as is this last project, the U.S. Bureau of Mines data. However, the metadata actually is all indexed on the NGG DPP website because that's what we turn in at the end of each of these projects. But anyway, my goal is to centralize the location for our use and get some standardized user-friendly access to this information. Just very briefly, I wanted to talk about the USGS website where you can actually go look up these sites. I just want to say that while they're indexing an awful lot of data from pretty much all the surveys, and it's much improved from what it was when they started, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, and I'm just going to say it's a work in progress, basically. Over these, and let me go to historical EER surveys. I want to show you some of the data that we captured in some of the collections. This one I found particularly interesting because we're people doing EER surveys generally for water resources. And I kind of noticed when I looked at this, I noticed a pattern in here. And to me, it kind of looked like the Muhammad Aquifer. I actually remarked to Tim Young about that, and I think also Tim Larson, if I remember correctly, that, boy, that sure looks like the Muhammad Aquifer. And it turns out, yeah, it pretty much, there really isn't a whole lot of call for EER data if you already know you're above the Muhammad Aquifer. And of course, you can pick a point, and for example, you can pick this most northeastern point here and pull up a PDF of the report for that location. And there's actually a summary sheet here first. Up in Lake County, Winthrop Harbor, almost in Wisconsin, which I think Don knows Wisconsin pretty well. But the point being, you can connect the points to data and pull it out. Some of the other collections, just showing some of the spatial breadth of them. For example, we did a subset of Herb Glass's key XRD results over his 50-year career, really. There's really a lot more that could be done, but these were the most important results and locations as determined by Herb and also Myrna. That one. Here's an example of a collection that we didn't actually do the scanning because it's groundwater reports, and there's basically a room full of filing cabinets with groundwater reports. And that would be an awful lot of scanning. So basically we just indexed the groundwater reports, which actually overlap a little bit. They actually also contain some EER reports, which could be another project someday, rectify them with the other EER reports. But again, you can kind of see there's certain areas where there's really not a lot of call for water reports. And I should mention that Rick Rice did quite a bit of help on this one, and originally Ross Brower set up a lot of this data. As far as I know, it's still on the fourth floor, although I haven't checked lately. Hopefully it is. Another collection, a set of collections we've worked on a lot with both Rod Morby and Don Mikulik is the paleo collections over in the annex. And this just gives you an idea of the breadth of the collection and some of the locations. And the other thing that you might notice is that some of these, for example, this one, boy, that location, that looks like it's in the center of that county. And One thing I do keep with all the metadata is the locations is the precision of location. And yes, it turns out that this particular location is only accurate to the nearest county. I didn't actually get the key on here, but the round red circles are data that's only precise to a county. And there's actually some, these here are only precise to a state, which really aren't too useful, but I think it's better to at least have the data visible, showing you've got data in the general area. And then in some of these, like with the crosshairs, we have multiple sections or GPS locations, for example, on those points. And of course, you can kind of show that the geology doesn't stop at the Illinois border. You can zoom out and see we have some samples across various selections across the Midwest. We can look at another collection that there actually already was, it's just a corrosive collection, which is in the basement cabinets, as many of you probably know. We actually had a database table in Oracle describing the collection, but it didn't have coordinates, so we did a project where we added coordinates for each location, so we can see just where these samples are. And you can see they're from around Illinois, Midwest. Well, they're from really around the whole U.S., and they're more or less worldwide, although they're concentrated in the U.S. and Europe. Another interesting collection is the Lake Michigan core data. In the early 1970s, we participated in several cruises to collect lake bed data. A lot of that data was published, but the original data is basically sitting in a few boxes in a back room over at the end, over at the GRU, and we went ahead and scanned all that data and also entered locations for all the data. So now we know exactly where we covered across all these projects and where we have, for example, core samples. And also, we didn't know this when we started, but apparently they also did some work in the Chain Lakes area. I want to say something a little bit about the yellow dots here, which are core samples. Turns out these are core samples that are in our core library, and they have over at the annex, and they have core numbers, and they have locations, but you won't find them in our database because they can't be given a county number and hence aren't given an API number. So this is kind of an example of a hidden collection that you kind of have to know about, and up till now, recently anyway, you have to actually go look in the card catalog. Another thing I did was I went ahead and plotted the Chain of Lakes data over a detailed map, because I was just kind of wondering, well, how accurate are these pre-GPS era locations? They probably use some type of ship navigation device, and it looks to me like they're pretty accurate. For example, here's a couple of points in this river up in Wisconsin, and you see at least at this scale, they are within the river. And of course, when you have data on collections, you can do other interesting things, not necessarily geological, but interesting nonetheless. For example, this is data from this last project here, the U.S. Bureau of Mines. You can see it's basically either boom or bust for the Galena area. And quite a peak here in the 40s, apparently. Another collection that we did a lot of work on, and probably the largest amount of work, was the typed field notes. We scanned all 68,000 roughly of them. Actually, we had the library scan, and they offered us a deal we couldn't refuse. We got a really good deal on that. But we then data entered all the locations, which are often either plotted in the grid or noted in the notes here, to multiple quarters. In this case here, this is actually a location, and it's about 3.5 quarters precision actually. And I actually developed a very sophisticated and efficient way to data enter all this data very quickly and efficiently, and that really helped in getting all 97,000 entries done within the 1-year time frame of one of these small contracts. Again, you can look at data by year, for example. You have to take this with a grain of salt because somebody at some time decided which field notes were worth typing up and that type of thing. But I did note some interesting things. For example, it appears like during the Depression, there's kind of a peak for whatever reason, probably Depression era work projects. I think I've seen some references to that in some materials. But again, you have to take this with a grain of salt. It's somewhat subjective. Again, here's some more subjective data, like where are we doing all our field work, at least pre-1980s, which is about when the type field notes stopped. Apparently Fulton County is a winner, but you can see they're actually pretty well distributed throughout the state, even the top ones. And well, for Piatt County, they're so close, but apparently not a whole lot of work there. But of course, we got this spatially, and why look at it that way when you can actually show, well, look, here's where the interesting areas are in Illinois geologically. And I should mention something. I think a long time ago, Kurt Ebert put a bug in my ear about doing a heat map, perhaps about this. I think, anyway, I have to give him at least partial credit for something like this. It's always interesting to look at data in different ways. Actually, I hesitate even putting this one up, but you can see some people put quite a few notes into our type field notes. Apparently, H.B. Woolman is the winner. But again, you have to take this with a grain of salt. So, working with historical data has been interesting, educational. It's helped me to understand how data becomes lost. It's been occasionally entertaining. As a matter of fact, I would like to show you probably my favorite field note that I just came across by accident reviewing scanned field notes. And I don't expect you to read this whole thing, but you can see in 1927, Mr. M.M. Layton made a trip up to the Waukegan area to review reported deposits of native mercury in Lake County. One guy had mercury leaking and seeping into his basement. School kids were picking it up out of construction areas. It was seeping out of dirt at various houses. But of course, as you might guess, there are no known occurrences of mercury in undisturbed glacial drift. These all occurred in man-made fill material. And I just kind of find it interesting that they kind of emphasize that they have no idea what could be the source of the mercury. But even back in 1927, I could make some good guesses about the Waukegan area. And then just really quickly, again, I mentioned we're entering field note locations very precisely. And you can plot those on maps, and you can see, for example, these are all points where there's a field note. We're actually just east of the St. Louis area and actually just east of Cahokia here. And you can see there's a lot of points that they all pretty much match up with this bluff here. And then you see some other ones going up ravines, that type of thing. But one reason I'm showing you this is I'm kind of interested in one of the field notes kind of in this area. So let's zoom in there. And you can see that's section 34, but we could put imagery up, but you know what? We got LiDAR, which looks a lot more interesting, so we'll use that. You can see this is a node here. This is actually a traverse that we captured from the field notes, and you can see you can pretty much figure out, and actually it continues into 35, you can pretty much figure out where that traverse was. They just went up the valley there. And here's the actual note. You could see it was originally visited by J. Marvin Weller in 1928. Remember that year. And yes, it's a hollow up which a road passes, and he's looking at outcrops. But what I found really interesting, this is another one of my favorite field notes. I'll let you guys read it, but starting here, I never smelled mash stronger than it was here. The St. Louis bootleggers must draw part of their supply from here. So again, I constantly come across interesting things doing these projects. Here's another one from the industrial minerals files, historical files. I presume I've not seen any geologists dressed like this lately. I don't know, is anybody? But and apparently I'm not going to get those hats from Geophysical or that either. Nice boots too. But yeah, 1940s, biogeochemical trip. Apparently they were looking after plants that had called mineral weed that apparently liked areas with lead and other minerals. Other interesting things you come across, like wartime reports that were commissioned by the government, specific areas. This one happens to be from Joe Davies County, but there's actually a lot from the fluorite district down in southern Illinois. Most of these are actually in our manuscript library, but a couple were not. And actually, I still need to work with Ann on that. But in any case, we did scan all of them, including the ones in the library, so we now have digital copies of some of these unpublished reports. Another interesting thing I came across was apparently the original plates, or whatever you want to call them, from Bulletin 21 from 1914. And just the interesting thing about this is, well, if you were to blow up the picture here, any picture in any of these bulletins, well, as you know, there's screen prints, and you'll just get a bunch of big dots. You won't get any more detail. But if you blow up this picture, you'll actually get quite a bit more detail. Let's just also mention that we've, for next year, we've made a proposal to scan our oldest images, which we have negatives for, going back to the early 1900s. So we'll actually be able to have very detailed imagery of our oldest images. One last interesting thing I came across, this is from another lead mining district down in Hardin County, but it's just the oldest thing I happened to come across recently. And it's quite a few pages, but you know, I actually haven't read it, but there could be interesting data in there. It's just historical data, very interesting. And I'm going to leave you with one last thing. I ran across this cartoon in the New Yorker around the time I started here, and I put it up on my bulletin board because I thought it kind of applied to the survey. And actually, I still think it kind of does, but I'd like to think not as much as it did 10 years ago. And not only because maybe those laptops should be replaced with iPads and iPhones. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Don, who's a geologist who's actually worked with a lot of this data, and we'll be talking about the geologic relevance of the data and other things.
Thank you, Ron.
The other arrow.
Yes. I'm just going to talk about two specific sort of projects that involve a lot of historic data. And of course, Ron's already talked about the Galena lead zinc mining activity. And this is one of the oldest production of mineral resources in Illinois, starting in the very early 1800s. This map is from 1829. And at that time, there was more people living around Galena, Illinois than there was in Chicago, and probably just about any other part of the state. So the Galena industry was a real big industry for a long time. The first railroad that was built in Illinois was built from Chicago to Galena, so they could ship the Galena from Galena to Chicago instead of having to go down the Mississippi River. So it was a major product. Through time, the mines became less productive. This is a photograph from the Kip mine. The caption says 1906, and it said that that pile that you see there is worth $15,000, which sounds like somewhat of an exaggeration. You can tell that that's actually not a coal mine, because you can see in the middle there's a guy smoking a cigar, which you usually don't do in coal mines. So there's a lot of history, and there was a lot of importance in this industry, and there was a lot of information generated since the early 1800s. These are what we have are basically ways to document the location of mines, which is real important, and to get information on geology that is basically not being generated anymore. So it's old information, but it's still very useful. There's not a lot of cause to be drilling bedrock cores, for example, in Joe Davies County these days. So we have this tremendous amount of information, and the idea is to try and preserve this and make it as useful as we can. Now, the other thing I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is the TARP project in Chicago. It's a major publicly financed project to improve essentially the drainage issues in Chicago, and something to do with their sewage. Chicago, as you know, is built in a flat plain. It's never had good drainage. It has a few weak streams flowing out into the lake. And when people started to settle there, they had trouble even building a sewer system, because it wouldn't drain down to anything. They had to raise the streets 10 feet high so they could make an incline for the sewage essentially to drain down into the rivers. And the rivers slowly meandered out into Lake Michigan, and of course people died. So there's always been a tremendous amount of interest in doing something about that. People dying isn't certainly not a good economic program to try and get people to move to Chicago. And their first thing to do was to try and drain the sewage away from Lake Michigan. And what they did is they made a canal and drained it down to the southwest to the Illinois River, and ultimately down to St. Louis. People down that direction weren't happy about it, but that's what they did with the sewage. But that only worked for a certain amount of time. In the 1950s, people thought it wasn't acceptable to dump all the sewage into these streams and just let it do what it was going to do. So there's been continuous efforts to improve this system. And the most recent one is the TARP project, that's been going on for a long time. What they're doing with TARP is building a network of deep tunnels and bedrock, generally about 250 feet to 350 feet deep. These tunnels are mostly about 30 feet in diameter. And most of this project was paid for with federal money. The federal government doesn't do that. There's still other cities and other states that are currently, and Indiana is a good example. Indianapolis is currently building a small system like this, and I think most of that is state funded. So Illinois is lucky in that they got most of this to be funded by the federal government. And at the time the slide was made, there had been about $4 billion invested in this. And since these are deep tunnels, there was a lot of emphasis on geology, and there's a lot of geologic information generated. So we have about over 100 miles of tunnels. The tunnels are virtually all complete now throughout the Chicago area, and 3 big reservoirs have been built. One is under construction yet, and that, of course, is Thornton. Many of you have been to Thornton, and Thornton is it's the north pit is being converted into a reservoir. The rest of the quarry is not going to be affected. So all this work has generated a tremendous amount of stuff in way of samples and all kinds of reports. And the Chicago probably has the best sampling of bedrock geology of any metropolitan area in the country. Tremendous amount of deep drilling went on in planning for this project. And of course, that generated lots of geotechnical reports of all different kinds. I know of about 120 of them. There's probably 120 or 30 that I don't either know about or have yet. A lot of effort's been directed towards this, and this is where what we're trying to do is get this information in some sort of public facility that you can actually get it all together and see what's available. These reports are all done mostly for contractors and a little bit for internal use from a sanitary district. And so a lot of these reports don't exist anywhere except for either in our building or down in the sanitary district's deep storage. So what we try and do is get these geotechnical reports, get them all here, get them into the system, document where data exists, where holes have been drilled, where tests have been run on samples, and things like that. And I like to point out that every year in a state like Illinois, there are thousands probably of borings of various types that are drilled, many of them drilled for public works projects or paid for public funds. That information doesn't get in our files usually. It's usually just disappears. And so this is a big hole in our data acquisition. We can't afford to go out and generate this stuff ourselves. We can't go out and drill most of the cores we have, for example, in our core facility. Probably 90% or more of those things have been generated by either private business or by public works projects of some sort. And by chance, we acquired that material. It wasn't drilled by us. So anyway, so there's a lot of this kind of information that's out there for the TARP project, basic geotechnical reports, significant geophysical logging was done on a lot of these holes, and even a major seismic study was done, literally driving trucks through the streets of Chicago to get information on various aspects of bedrock geology. Unfortunately, the original logs of that were all here at one time, but they've all been thrown away. So we can't reinterpret anything by enhanced study of those original data strips. So the TARP system is a series of these big tunnels. As I said, you can see them here. All the tunnels are now complete except for some minor connecting tunnels. And the only reservoir that's in major construction yet is the one in the middle, McCook Quarry. For these tunnels, there was extensive bedrock drilling. This is just a map showing you that it was done not at one time. It was done for specific projects as these things were planned and developed in the Chicago area. This is some basic information showing you the range of depths and the numbers of cores that were drilled, bedrock cores. These are all bedrock cores. And you can see we have some going down over 1,600 feet, which is amazing depths for bedrock cores, particularly in a major metropolitan area. Most of the short ones are actually drilled for one primary project that was done with a lot of shallow drilling, and then a lot of these other shallow holes were drilled around deeper cores for planning and designing of construction shafts and things like that. But what was done is drilled fairly deep holes throughout most of the Chicago area. Initially, they planned on putting this tunnels in the Ordovician Galena dolomite underneath the Maquoketa Shale, and then they realized, well, the Maquoketa Shale is a good way to make sure we don't contaminate anything below that. So they ended up putting the tunnels in the Silurian above the Maquoketa. And throughout the Chicago area, that's usually a depth of anywhere from 200 to 400 feet. And so these are pretty deep holes. And the good thing is we have them throughout most of the area. Like I said, there's no other metropolitan area that I'm aware of, certainly in the Midwest, that has anything like this for information. Okay, we got a lot of cores from that. That's been an issue. Why preserve all these cores? Because we still need to study these things, and I'll talk a little bit about that. There was almost 200,000 feet of drilling, about 160,000 feet of bedrock cores. The survey has in its collections about 21,000 feet of cores. About 21,000 feet have either been thrown away or destroyed or something like that. And we have in temporary storage about 160,000 feet. There are more things that we don't have because those numbers are up to about 1990. And of course, there's been more study for just the TARP system itself and other projects by the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District drilling. So these are some pictures of cores that I actually found in the basement of a building with documentation sitting on them. The district didn't know where these cores were. So, but we don't have them yet. We don't have the data. We don't have the cores. We don't have anything. So there's problems with this storage of these huge volumes of samples. There's no dissemination, archiving, and printed materials and reports except for what we're trying to do. There's well, really nobody thought much about preserving this information. I think if we would start a project like this, or somebody started a project like this involving billions of dollars, I think we would probably suggest that maybe they set aside a couple hundred thousand for a pole barn or something and preserve the samples at least for the long term. That wasn't considered when HARP was started in the 60s. So things remain to be done. This is just a little bit of our current temporary storage. You can see it's not particularly accessible at the moment. We need to try and do something about that. But why is it important to preserve this original material? If we have all this data, why do we need the original samples? Well, there's a number of reasons why, and then why do we need to have specific sampling spacing? If you have one core that's only a few hundred feet from another, why would you want to save both? Well, you can see right here some examples of significant changes in geology over relatively short distances. So just because something's close to another one, it doesn't mean it's not valuable. So we have issues like that. And I want to point out something that sort of final thing is I'm currently trying to use this TARP information, trying to use it for a long time, to enhance our knowledge of the bedrock geology in the Chicago area, of course. And this is a log that we have. There's a log book right there. You can see some of these logs where these are the things that the district did with their consultants and published in their own internal reports. And you can see they have a stratigraphic column and things like that, and they have stratigraphic names. And then on the right side, they have all kinds of test data. So what we found is that most of the stratigraphic names aren't accurate, and most of the pixel boundaries aren't accurate. But we do have all this test data, things like Packer tests and engineering examinations, different intervals and stuff like that. So even if the stratigraphic names in these reports aren't valuable, you still have a location by footage. So presumably the data is at least presented in an accurate form. And you can convert that back to our modern stratigraphy as we relog these cores. Just to point out some of the problems in the Silurian, which is I worked with, the TARP, in the entire TARP system, the district didn't recognize any Devonian rocks. There's a whole bunch of holes around Lake Calumet that have Devonian rocks up to 30, 40, maybe even 50 feet there. They thought they were all Silurian. So you can't pick a basic feature like the Silurian-Devonian boundary in these logs. Okay, and then there's other issues with the Ordovician-Silurian boundary, which you would think would be another one they should be able to pick adequately. Here, the distance between our logging and theirs is only a couple feet difference, except for there's major revisions now in the age of the Silurian Ordovician boundary, and actually about maybe up to 75 feet or something that would be considered Silurian. Even on our recent studies would now be considered Ordovician. So why is all that stuff important? Well, people are always making things like isopac maps and stuff like that. And if your thicknesses, you don't have the right boundaries in them, you're getting erroneous results. The only other horizon that's regularly picked out within the Silurian that can even be recognized in well cuttings. I mean, I should say that the Silurian is an unfortunate unit because it's basically all dolomite throughout the entire state. It's not like Ordovician where you have Maquoketa shale and you have Galena Platteville carbonates and then you have St. Peter sandstone. These really conspicuous differences in lithology where you can at least divide up the column like that. The Silurian is all dolomite. There is one horizon where back in the 40s and 50s when we had people like Lou Workman here logging cuttings, they could recognize this major break within the Silurian. It's basically at the Kankakee Joliet contact. And that's something that's very prominent. It's a global feature throughout the world, actually, major sea level drop. Unfortunately, the terminology that was used in the district's TARP reports misnames all of these units. So you can't use that information for anything. They don't recognize the basal member of the Joliet as occurring. It's usually a red unit in some places and gray unit in others. If it was red, they called it by its right name, Brandon Bridge. If it was gray, they thought it was the next unit up and the Brandon Bridge wasn't there, and everything going all the way up the rest of the column is therefore mislabeled. So we need the samples yet to figure out the basic geology and get the stuff right. But you also need this original data to make sure that you know where these holes were drilled, and if you have test data on specific intervals that you can match by footage to these cores. You can put all that stuff together and get useful information. So in a major metropolitan area like Chicago, which is the biggest one in the Midwest, we have a tremendous amount of information that was never placed in a particular repository other than buried in the district's records, that has all kinds of very important geologic information in it. And it hasn't been used to a great extent because these reports and everything haven't been centralized and located. But now we have maps that really show where the holes were, and you can start to get an idea of what's actually available for future projects. So with that, I don't have much else to say. We do have examples of some of these. Ron's talked about these galena, well, there's lead zinc mining reports, and I do have one of the TARP reports here you can look at. There's a tremendous amount of information, and we're trying to get this stuff together so that it's usable, which is, I guess, the whole purpose of this funding for these kinds of projects anyways. Lots of stuff out there, a lot of it nobody knows about, and therefore it's seldom of ever used. Thank you.
Go to the next slide.
Any questions for Ron?
When you scan them in, you go OCRing them also? And
We try to OCR them, but in most cases, we can't get a good OCR. Even on the neatly typewritten field notes, they are OCR'd and get maybe about 90% on average at best, but you don't get every word.
Yeah,
a lot of stuff we don't get
layered
anything.
PDF then afterwards?
Pardon me?
Use a layered PDF, or when you put it out, are you putting it out as a layered PDF? So you have the original on the front, and the back is the searchable stuff that you've OCR'd?
No, we don't do that because, like I said, it's not accurate enough to do that. So we just put out the straightforward PDF where, yes, you can still search the text, and it will show up if it's there, as from the original scan, not the interpreted OCR. Yeah, that really, unless you have really good OCR, I think that mode doesn't work too well, in my experience.
This might be a bit of a policy question, it seemed to answer, but what would the two of you suggest for where does data preservation fit within the strategies for the survey? I mean, where is it? Is it a priority or no? I guess that's the answer.
I don't know how much of a priority it is within the survey. Maybe you have a better idea. There's lots and lots of stuff that we have that nobody knows about. You know, and a lot of it's important information.
What would you suggest for the director if you were talking to the investor about where this fits within?
Well, I think one thing that could be done is simply try and make up a list of all the different collections, or whatever you want to call them, and say, this is here. You know, we have this TARP stuff. We have these early photographs, which are something that nobody seems to know much about around here. We have this kind of material, and it's available if somebody wants to try and use it. That's kind of the first step. At least then we know there's nothing really lost, hopefully. But that would be probably one of the most important things. And then what's done with that, you know, it's always a budget thing. People want to spend money on what they're doing now. They don't want to go back and spend money on what's been done in the past. You know, that's somebody else's decision, but you should do something with it.
Well, I think that's a good point. You can't preserve what you don't know.
Yeah.
What you have. So,
Now, I should say we did.
Who would assemble that list? Ron.
Yeah, I should say we did start the NGG DPP project with making a list of our known collections, but that was early on. I didn't know about every collection. I did try to ask around a little bit, but not as much maybe as I should have. But we do have a set of some known collections, some of which you haven't processed, but yes, it didn't have some of the things you've talked about lately, for example, the negatives, and there's quite a few more things as well that weren't on that original list, and we've added to it along the way. We're still slowly adding to it, but yeah,
And just
we
as-
need to keep adding to it, basically.
I mean, there's the samples, you go out in the annex, you start opening drawers, and then you find obscure little collections. Of a few
Well, we
drawers,
actually
something
did go through the annex as well, and we do
Oh,
have a
okay.
drawer level inventory of the annex that could be used, that someone needs to look at and say, here's what we have.
You saying annex or attics?
Annex.
Annex.
Sorry.
How extensive is your metadata when you work with this? Are you putting it for a whole collection or individual pictures or well?
It's item level metadata typically, so, but it's just a little bit of descriptive information, but most importantly, a location and then what type of data it is and that type of thing. And then it's usually a scan or a reference to a paper collection that we can pull.
And are you putting unique numbers on them?
Yes.
And are they the API numbers or what?
If they fit into the API system, yes, we did assign API numbers, for example, to some of the borehole data we worked with on prior projects to this one, and we still need to assign some for the current project, actually. Yes, we do assign them when we can.
So to answer Don Lewin's kind of question, there is a effort across the institute itself on data stewardship and trying to get a catalog or whatever of what is existing, not just here, but in all 5 surveys. And there's people from each survey working on that.
Chris?
You were getting back to the sanitary district stuff up in the Chicago area. Are they doing any particular effort to try to preserve some of the data that has been collected, especially the cores and so forth?
They're not trying to save any of the samples. I believe all the reports and all of maybe the raw data reports, things like that, are just deep storage. When they're done with it, it goes probably in Kansas or somewhere. So it's difficult to retrieve this stuff if you know it exists. It's some effort to get it out and expensive. So they're hoping, and I assume they're doing that. I mean, that's sort of what I heard. I can't guarantee that everything's being saved.
All right. If there's no more questions, thank our speakers.
I must have looked at maps here.
That's the part I like.